I think sometimes when we imagine conflict, we think it has to be like two people arguing or getting into a fist fight. But really, conflict can be something very simple, like, oh, I can't find my pencil. Like, that's a conflict, right? That's a problem that needs to be solved. So it doesn't have to be incredibly high stakes. And I think sometimes storytellers, we make the mistake of acting like, oh, it has to be save the world level stakes. So I think that just thinking of conflict as there are these two things at odds, there's a problem, there's going to be on the other side of that, like a decision needs to be made. Like conflict implies that the characters or people, they need to make a choice. And then it's seeing that choice that I think is of interest to us as.
Welcome to Influence. In today's episode, we had Diane Callahan. Diane has always had a passion for storytelling. Whether it be through her writing in fiction and nonfiction or poetry, she loves to share stories that inspire and motivate others. Her work as a developmental editor has helped countless authors share their stories with the world, and her work as the founder of the Quotidian Writer YouTube Channel has allowed her to reach millions of people with her messages of hope and inspiration. When it comes to influence, Diane has made her mark on the storytelling community. Whether you're an author or an entrepreneur, storytelling plays an important role in the impact you want to make in this world. And Diane is a resource you can trust to learn from. Enjoy the show. Diane Callahan, welcome to Influence.
Hi, it's so nice to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're on the channel. I gave the bit of an intro, but for those listening, your background is in storytelling, and you've got this fantastic channel where you really help people learn how to tell and write better stories. So I'd love to start off this interview with asking you where your journey in storytelling began. When did it all just become important, or just when did storytelling catch your interest?
Yeah, well, I think like most writers, that reading has always been a huge part of my life. So as a kid, I was just constantly consuming books, and I really loved sort of sampling different life experiences. And I think that's what I find so much value in storytelling. It enables you to live a million lives, right? And I also like having that opportunity to learn something new every day as a reader, and then as a writer to be able to sort of sink into myself and understand myself better in the world around me. And that gives me a way to engage with it on a deeper level. And so from a young age, I was a reader first, and then I always wanted to be a writer and an author, because I think when you read a lot, you kind of develop this appreciation for stories, and you want to discover how the sausage gets made. So you start to delve into that yourself. And so when I was on that writing journey along there, I sort of took the path towards getting an English degree, and I have minors in creative writing and professional writing. I was very interested in just mastering writing as a skill, and that's the writing and storytelling, like in all its forms, not just fiction, but every format you can think of, like essays and poetry and things like that. So I think that out of that came my desire to teach writing as an editor, and that's where my YouTube channel came from. So everything's sort of interconnected, but I always see myself as a reader first, a writer second, and an editor third. So
Dan, I'd love to ask, while you were on your journey, was there one thing that you were learning about storytelling that just excited you the most? Like as soon as it was something that you can do, you just found yourself like falling even more in love with the art of storytelling itself?
yeah, I mean, I think that seeing how many ways that you can play with structure and format, and just there's such a wide variety of things that you can do with fiction in particular. And I love seeing people be innovative in the form and using second person with you, or like I love The Stranger by Albert Camus, and that one is where like it's sort of an existential novel, and the format of it, the way it's written, is kind of matches the function of it, where it's this whole philosophical idea, and when you read it, you can really feel that sink into you just from the way it's written. So I think that there's so much power in storytelling with how versatile it is, and that's what really excites me. So I love coming across books that do things I haven't seen done before, or that make me feel like I've really sunk into a different life. So that's one of my favorite things about stories.
Oh, I like that so much. It sounds like
you were able to discover how many different ways you can go about structuring stories. And on your journey, you've learned that there's even more ways that are yet to be discovered. And it just excites you every time you see like a new approach or an author do something different. You're like, huh, that's interesting. I like that.
Absolutely. Because I think that sometimes we get boxed in with what ideas we think exist for structure, for story structure. And then we see somebody else do it and it works. And we're like, oh, wow, there are more possibilities here. Like, I don't have to just stay in this one box. I can really experiment and do different things.
Oh, I see. Now, many of the people listening are typically people that are looking to write their own stories, whether it's for the business or whether or not they're also fiction writers. And I believe structure is a big, important part of knowing, how you're going to approach, your writing. So if I was to ask you, with all the structures that you learned, what is the structure that you go to, or what is your writing process?
Writing process. So it depends on what I'm writing, but I absolutely agree that structure is very valuable as a tool for writers. Like, I'm reading The Elements of Style. It's an old school editing book, but one of the principles in there is that idea of structure informs, how you shape what you're writing. So when you have structures, have certain expectations, and you want to meet the reader's expectations. And so that's what structure is useful for. And so for me, with my writing process, when it comes to fiction, I think that I love to open with an interesting premise, an interesting hook. So I always start there with something that's like, okay, what's a conflict that's going to catch the reader's attention? And, is it going to be, one of the story ideas I still want to write, I haven't gotten around to it, but it's a couple comes home and their house is gone, just completely gone. And then everybody is like, what do you mean? There's never been a house there. And then that's the conflict. And that's how you get people in, like, oh, that idea sounds interesting. And so my writing process is sort of branching off from that central idea and finding ways to build on it and explore it in interesting ways. And I think that's true for anything else. Like, for when I'm writing a script for YouTube, I'll do that as well, where I'll start with the topic. Like the folktale video I did recently was my friend Joe Webb, and he's very interested in folktale types of stories, I noticed. And I was like, oh, I'd love to do a video like that and shape it around basically his expertise in my mind. And I sort of brought in different things from that. And so for me, I see myself very much as a curator of ideas, and no matter what I'm writing. So part of telling that story and part of that writing process is gathering all this information and then trimming it down to the essentials.
I want to take a moment and spend some time on conflict. From my understanding in storytelling, I could be wrong, but conflict is the heartbeat of any story. Unless the conflict is engaging, and unless the conflict has something at stake, then it's just not really that interesting for people that are either reading or listening to the story. So if I was to ask you how you would like define conflict or explain conflict, how would you go about explaining that to somebody?
Yeah, this is a topic that really interests me as well. It's something I think about a lot as an editor and as a writer. And I think that conflict is usually just when somebody wants something and there's something in the way, or there's just two things at odds. And I think sometimes when we imagine conflict, we think it has to be like two people arguing or getting into a fist fight. But really, conflict can be something very simple, like, oh, I can't find my pencil. Like, that's a conflict, right? That's a problem that needs to be solved. And it can also be a very simple problem of like, oh, I can't choose between these two types of desserts. Like, there's ice cream and there's cake. How do I possibly choose? Like, that's also conflict. So it doesn't have to be incredibly high stakes. And I think sometimes storytellers, we make the mistake of acting like, oh, it has to be save the world level stakes. And a lot of times you can have those very personal individual stakes that create good conflict, and sometimes even more relatable conflict, like, like trying to get a piece of paper into a trash can. Like, that's actually kind of fun to watch people do in real life too. You're not going to base an entire story around it. I mean, I would challenge somebody to do it. I would be very impressed if they can write a short story or something around that type of conflict. But so I think that just thinking of conflict as there are these two things at odds, there's a problem, there's going to be on the other side of that, like a decision needs to be made. Like, conflict implies that the characters or people, they need to make a choice. And then it's seeing that choice that I think is of interest to us as people.
So I want to take this a step further, if you want to kind of hang with me here,
Mhm.
and ask, why do you believe conflict is so interesting and intriguing to human beings? Why do we love conflict and just gravitate towards it?
Yes, I think this is because humans are just by nature, we're problem solving creatures. Like when we see a problem, we want to solve it. And we're always looking for problems to solve and things to achieve. And I think that's ties into how when we have a goal and we achieve it, all of a sudden that tension, that conflict, that drive is gone. And then we're like, oh, I need this other goal so that I can pursue this next thing. And so I think that is sort of part of our natures. And I don't know, quite where that comes from, biologically or things like that. But I think it is, connects to survival. It connects to just the way that we move about the world. So yeah, I think that's really at the heart of it, is that we love puzzles. We love puzzles. We love figuring things out. We like seeing how, like, okay, what should I do in this situation? How do I make this better? How do I like optimize this? So
Okay, this is a fantastic lead into my next question, which is about your most recent video on what you can learn from folktales or writing tips in regard to folktales. And I apologize on the exact titling there,
oh no, it's good.
but you had talked about in the video that although we can't relate to venturing into a forest, we can imagine venturing venturing into things in our lives where it's just unknown and we don't really know what the outcome is going to be. And that's part of what makes folktales really relatable, is although these creatures aren't in our lives and these circumstances aren't in our lives, it can tie into something that feels feels like what it's like to be human or live through the human journey. Can we talk about the folktales and the relationship between real life and stories?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's the same reason that we sort of gravitate towards that hero's journey structure as well. I think that we, as people, generally like the idea of people going through hardship and then learning something from it, because the stories that we tell ourselves are very important for self-conception and for how we view life in general, because I think we all want to have a purpose and in life, because that's what gives it meaning. And we create meaning through stories, even if those stories are sort of manufactured, right? Like we try to create narratives from our experiences, and folktales are sort of a subconscious branching off of that. Like folktales are adding magical beliefs and creatures, but they often represent other feelings, or they represent, just this idea of there being magic and purpose in the world. Like, oh, this challenge exists for a reason, that I'm supposed to go through this challenge and come out the other side. I'm being tested. And I think that, that connects to a lot of religious ideas as well. So the idea of myths and fables and things like that are also connected to the ways we tell narratives about our existence as a species and as individuals. And regardless of whether those narratives are true, I think that they're very valuable.
Oh, I see. That makes complete sense to me. Thank you so much for sharing. I'd like to take the conversation over to an example that you had in that video, and it was about the Green Knight. And I believe it was the protagonist was somebody who wanted to prove himself to be a knight. And I believe his journey was a year long, and he ran into many tests on that journey that tested his character, but he wasn't aware he was being tested, although it was pretty obvious to the people around you, which I feel like is so relatable. Like, how many times do people tell us, pretty obviously, like, hey, do you realize like what you're doing, even though it's not obvious to us at the time? Can we talk about that? Like where the fact that like it's easy to see somebody's situation from the outside, but it's very difficult when you're in the first person. Can we talk about that for a minute?
Yes, I absolutely think that's true. And I think that's sort of the central conceit of stories, which is difficult because it's sort of like how, as a reader, you have this genre awareness. Like if you're reading a horror novel or you're watching a horror movie and you see them going through this sort of trial and tribulation, or, you're like, oh, don't go into the creepy room. There's going to be this terrible monster there. But we have that awareness as readers, but then the characters don't, because they're living like an ordinary life. And I think that's true for our lives too, where we're like, well, I'm living you think that you're living a romance, but really you're living a tragedy, right? Like that's the we have certain beliefs about our own lives, and then until we sort of step back and we tell that story of our lives like chronologically, then we sort of see the path of what happens. And I think that connects to how we sort of mythologize, I don't know how to pronounce that word, famous people's lives for authors and artists, things like that. So I think the Green Knight is an embodiment of that as well, of like, okay, he doesn't realize he's living this story necessarily, but when he's looking back on it, he's going to see the elements of that story, and he's going to create that same narrative that we created, where we're like, oh, well, this is what's going on, like this is what he's learning, this is what he's experiencing. And so I think that the hindsight is a big part of storytelling, and I think that it's the nice thing about stories too is that they give you that objective perspective to sort of look at things as a story, as a narrative. You're looking for meaning, versus in life, you don't always look for meaning in the moment you're experiencing it. You're not always crafting the story of your life. Or, if you're making lunch for yourself, you're not like, oh, my grand narrative of my life. You're just sort of living it. But then later you might be like, oh yes, like, all these times that I made lunch and it built up to me becoming a chef, in the future. And then that's becomes a story in retrospect.
So, again, it's the awareness, the first person awareness just isn't there. And that's why it can be difficult as we're reading stories for the main character to realize what they have in front of them. And it, easy for us as readers. Here's my next question. Knowing that, is it, I don't know how I'm going to try to word this question, but could it be very, I don't want to say the word is hurtful, but if I'm an author, if I'm looking to write a story and I don't actually recognize that my character isn't going to be aware that these challenges are in front of them, but for me, I'm aware because I'm writing it. Is there a challenge that can happen in the writing that just doesn't really suck the readers in because it makes everything way too obvious?
Yeah, I think, no, it does. Because I think that that's sort of a problem with, I don't know, with writing anything, because readers can get frustrated at the characters for not doing certain things. Like in the horror movie, like they're like, oh, why are you doing this stupid decision? But it's not a stupid decision. They're just making a normal life choice. They don't know they're in the horror genre. And the same with romance, when, they meet somebody and they're like, oh yeah, like I don't like them at all, but they're the love interest. So you're like, stop being stupid. So I think that as readers have that perspective. And then from the writing point of view, I think there is that challenge too. It's like, okay, how do I have this character react in a way that's realistic for what they know now, and make sure I don't accidentally give them future knowledge? Because I've done that before in books or I've edited books like that, where the characters act as if they know how everything's going to play out. Like they're not uncertain enough. And so I think as a writer, you're like, oh, I have all the knowledge, I know the future. And then you almost imbue the character with this knowledge of the story, and you're like, no, the character needs to start at this point of like not knowing that. And so that's challenging as a writer, because it's like, and especially if you plot your stories in advance, I think that's one of the dangers of plotting, is you have to make sure that your character has that change over the course of the story in a way that's believable, where they don't just make choices where they're like, oh yeah, they made this choice because this is the direction the story wants to go. It's like, no, you have to stay with the character, and like, what would they believably do in that moment, given the knowledge they currently have. So
yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to spend a minute on just writing stories, really fictional stories in regard to the character, and just kind of take a step back from the actual character themselves and take a look at the world that the character lives in. I believe I heard a tip once, and I didn't quite understand, but it was knowing the world that your character lives in and knowing what the laws are of that world, and then being able to portray what those laws are to the reader so that they understand. In this fictional world, you can get hurt. In this fictional world, people can fly. Can you explain that a little bit when it comes to creating the environment that these characters live in?
Yes, because I think when it comes to world building and exposition in general, you want it to feel natural. And it's again that way of thinking of characters as what level of knowledge do they already have going into the story, because they've experienced this whole life before the start of the story. So you sort of have to imbue them with that knowledge. So if they have a certain knowledge of the world and the magic system or the setting or whatever it might be, whatever genre you're writing, like then that needs to come through on the page through how they act. And if they act like, oh yeah, I already know about all this thing. And so when they're explaining it, it sounds very familiar to them. They're not turning to the reader to start defining terms for them. So I think that's where it comes organically from the world. And so what the things that they treat as normal, you'll be like, oh, I guess invisibility is normal in this place. But then they act surprised when this other thing happens, which must mean that this is not normal. So you sort of have to establish those ground rules, I think, like oftentimes as early as possible in the book, so that you know what are like the limitations of what I'm seeing here? What are the parameters? So that way, as a reader, you know, okay, this is the normal thing for the world. This is the abnormal thing for the world. So that when you're experiencing it, you're not like, oh, I mean, I thought that this seems like this could happen in this world. But yeah, I think that is really important to know your magic system and your world inside out, just for that reason alone.
I feel like the task of writing or creating stories is such a cool use of the human mind and the use of imagination, and really being able to explore the limits of what is it you can create or think of that you can then portray through words and really engage, you know, an audience of people. I think it's such a cool art.
Really is.
I want to take the conversation over to another one of your videos, and it was on Show Don't Tell. Here's the problem I feel like I have, and I don't believe I'm alone in this, is that when we tell stories, we're constantly filling the narrative with stuff that we're telling. Like, instead of saying that the man threw a toaster across the room, we just say he was mad. We're always telling and just filling details in rather than showing. So my question to you is that a challenge that took time to really get used to showing? And do you have any advice for those that are trying to tell stories and are telling more than they're showing?
Well, I think it's first important to understand that telling is a tool, and that it is something that is incredibly useful, and you should absolutely tell, because I think that there's sort of this misconception that, oh, telling is bad and showing is good, and that's not necessarily true. And there's also a lot of ambiguity about the difference between the two, because, you know, in the example of like the man had a handlebar mustache, is that showing or is that telling? Like, to me, it's both. It's a statement of fact. He has a mustache, but then it's also a specific visual, which feels like showing to me. So that is what makes it very difficult, I think, to know the difference between those two things. But I think the importance is in narrative voice. That is the biggest thing when it comes to showing. So when somebody says, you know, show don't tell, they really want you to have narrative voice. And the way that I define narrative voice personally is injecting your writing with a sense of personality or emotion. And that usually comes through in your word choices and the rhythm of the sentences and the details that you choose to focus on. So it's, you know, how is this character viewing the world, and how are you making their personality come through on the page? And that is how you show over tell. And they can be telling you just like a whole paragraph of information about themselves, but if it comes in that really engaging voice, as if they're speaking to you, or as if the narrator in third person is speaking to you, then it's going to feel really strong, and you can get away with anything pretty much.
So approaching the story you're about to tell, if you approach it with the intention of really explaining like who the character is and their characteristics and their emotions, if you go into it with that intention, then the words that you choose to say and how you choose to lay things out just sort of evolves as more of, you know, like a showing. But even you said, like, it's not necessarily, you know, show don't tell. I mean, it's both really, but if you go with that intention, that's really what is what is engaging to people. That's what really catches people's attention. Did I catch that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's just, you're trying to be as unique as the people in the world are, right? And like my husband and I, we went on a vacation recently, and he was going through both sets of our pictures to make a collage, like a montage of all of them. And his pictures were more focused on like sort of the broader landscapes and things, and mine were more on the details, like, you know, like take a picture of like a ladybug or something like that. And so that's one way that our perspectives differ. So if you're telling a story, and if one person's going to notice sort of more about the spatial awareness of things, how things are situated together, and then this other person might be looking at the more granular details of, you know, the animals around, or the dewdrops on the blade of grass and things like that. And the way they describe it and what they notice is really going to shape the story and make it feel unique as opposed to generic. Because I think that's the problem with telling, is it makes your story feel generic, and you obviously don't want that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That makes so much sense. And that really helps click things in my mind. I'm sure it does for the listeners as well. So thank you for going into that. I'd like to take the conversation over to just more about like who is it you help or what is it that you do with your storytelling? I mean, you've got your YouTube channel, which we didn't really touch on that. So I'd actually like to ask you that. What was going on around the time that you started your YouTube channel? Like what motivated you and what's your real intention with it?
Yeah, so I think I started my channel in 2016. I posted my how to motivate yourself to write every day video, and I'd just gotten out of college, I think. So I'd made a lot of presentations on Keynote, which is basically PowerPoint for Mac. So I was familiar with that as a way of creating visuals. And I liked the idea of starting a channel because I didn't really see any other channels that were exploring fiction in that same way, of using like the visual components and then also using examples from books. Like I really wanted more YouTube channels about writing that were focused on novels and short stories as opposed to TV shows and movies. Because TV shows and movies, it's a lot easier to talk about them because you can throw a clip up on screen. But for a book, it's like, well, how do I talk about this and keep it interactive? So for me, I felt like that was a niche that wasn't filled, and I wanted to create that. And so that was what I was interested in exploring. And I also wanted to find advice for myself, basically, as a writer. You know, I never see myself as this sort of high and mighty like expert on writing. Like that is like the quotidian part of my quotidian writer is something that is ordinary or mundane or daily. Like it's not like I don't see myself as this guru when it comes to writing. And so for me, that's when I create my YouTube videos, it is really about learning alongside the viewer in a way. And I'm doing all this research and I'm learning all about this craft, and then I'm compiling it into this final product. It's like, okay, here's my opinion on this topic. Like, here you go, world. You can view it now and tell me what you think. And so that's what my YouTube channel has been for me, is like a way to grow as a writer. And then it also had the nice side effect of becoming a way that I attracted editorial clients. So I've never had to beg for work, which is really nice, and I appreciate that from everyone. So
people watch your channel and then they turn into being, clients of yours because they see your
yeah.
work, and you're a credible source because they're like, oh wow, she really knows what she's talking about.
Yeah, it acts as a portfolio just automatically, which has been really amazing. And I think it's even helped me get another job. Like I'm switching over to like a full-time arts marketing position, and I use my YouTube channel as part of that. And so I recommend it. I recommended it to everybody to start an online portfolio of some kind. I think it'll take you places you want to expect. So.
Right. And if you start your online portfolio really on YouTube, then you're not only do you have your portfolio, but it's also there for the world to see, and other people can learn from you, and really you can get work.
Yep, absolutely.
making it public. So who would you say benefits the most from your channel? Is it writers that are looking to write fiction, or is it people that just want to get into storytelling? Who would you say is like the ideal individual that goes to your channel?
Yeah, I would say it's the first, primarily people who write novels. I think that's always what I imagine as my primary audience. But I also get a lot of people who are writing screenplays or writing comic books, or they're just looking to learn English or to pass their high school English classes. And so I think there's a variety of audiences for the channel. But whenever I'm creating a video, I'm really thinking of like, okay, I want to teach to a writer who knows a bit about creative writing already, who knows a bit about fiction already. And so they have that baseline knowledge, but I want to go like a step above that and give them more.
Give them even more depth and more detail, and things that introduce things to them that they weren't necessarily aware of, that can really help expand their knowledge and their understanding of what it means to write.
Exactly.
Okay. That's amazing. So this has been a fantastic interview. I could talk about storytelling all day long. And I'd like to kind of just leave, with more of a general question, for those that are listening, for a question that perhaps I didn't ask you that you think I should have, that is going to be helpful for people. Is there anything that you feel would be good as far as advice for people that are just, they just want to sit down and get better at writing stories?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the advice, though. It's just write. That's it. Like that's my whole tagline for my channel, is whatever you do, keep writing. That's the number one thing to get better, is to keep writing and keep practicing. I also think that receiving feedback on your work is so valuable. Like at the end of the day, you can consume as much writing content as you want. This is, a slight knock on my own channel, but you can watch all of my videos. That's not going to make you a better writer as much as writing and then receiving feedback from other writers, from readers, from anybody who's willing to give you honest assessments. And that's, professional editors are good at that too. There's plenty of freelance editors out there, but there's also plenty of places you can find critique partners from Reddit and Twitter and Critique Circle and NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month. So there's so many resources out there that are free places for you to get that feedback. And it's with that feedback that you learn what's useful to you. You learn how your readers are experiencing the story, and then that really enables you to shape it into what you want your story to be.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I practiced storytelling for, gosh, I think it was 4 months. And my wife, she would just tell me, she's like, these aren't that good. And she's just, she's nice and she's honest. She's like, yeah, they're not great. But when she said that they were getting good, that's when I knew, okay, I'm starting to make progress. Like that was meaningful.
Yes.
I agree 100%.
Yeah, there's nothing like having somebody that's willing to be honest with you about what's working and what's not. Like I would rather have somebody who's honest than somebody who likes everything that I write. So
right. It's like, oh, that was so, that was so fantastic. And I think it's, human beings, we are typically kind creatures and we're very kind to each other. And to avoid conflict, we try not to, potentially be honest with something that that we feel, because we don't want to, let's say hurt someone's feelings, but it's those pieces of advice that just help us grow. And it's important that that we do share, a certain level of honesty.
And I think that it's also really valuable to have readers who have your best interest at heart. Like they genuinely want you to write the best story possible. And that's why they're giving you the feedback. They're not just tearing it apart because they don't like it. Like that's why it's important to have, develop good professional or friendship types of relationships where, oh, this person wants me to tell the best story possible. So whenever they give me criticism, it's not because they don't like me or the story just annoys them. It's because they're like, no, I want you to write this story and put it out there and have it be something you can really be proud of.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at the end of the day, a moral of the story is write, just write, and be okay with taking advice or actively look for people that will give you, the advice that you need to hear, because that's ultimately what's going to help you create a better writing system and just a process and really material. Now, where, for those that are listening, Diane, where can people find you or follow you aside from your YouTube channel? Is there any other handles or anything that that you direct people to follow you on your journey?
Yeah, I have a website, quotidianwriter.com. I also have a Ko-fi blog. I do monthly updates on there and sometimes behind the scenes notes for my videos. I'm also on Twitter, tentatively. It's also the Quotidian Writer on there as well. So it's pretty much, if you just Google Quotidian Writer, you'll find all my social pages. It's been very consistent across that, but I'm probably most active on Twitter, I would say. And then, yeah, like my monthly posts are more just where I share what I'm writing and what I'm reading. So
excellent. So for those listening, the links for all of those things will be in the description, but like Diane said, just Google search Quotidian Writer and you'll find all of her handles. Diane, I want to thank you so much for your time and your expertise and helping myself and the audience here today with storytelling.
Yeah, it's been really wonderful. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a great rest of your day. And for those that are listening, thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.